It's not China and it's not Europe. This time, the threat to American car makers is coming from an unexpected place: our northern neighbor. In a move that has blindsided Washington and rattled major automakers, Canada has launched a strategic trade offensive that's putting the entire U.S. automotive sector in jeopardy. Factories are scrambling, labor unions are fuming, and the price of cars could be about to skyrocket. How did this quiet ally turn into a disruptive force, and what does it mean for you? If you're enjoying this video, give it a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button for more awesome content. Don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Symbiotic economic relationship. But that calm facade shattered when Washington imposed tariffs aimed at protecting certain American industries. Rather than backing down, Canada retaliated with a precise, calculated response, and the automotive sector is taking the hardest hit. Instead of slapping random tariffs on everything in sight, Canadian leaders took aim at a handful of critical sectors where America is most vulnerable, and guess what rose to the top of their list? Cars and car parts? With billions of dollars in cross-border trade at stake, Canada knew exactly where to strike to send a clear message. They won't be bullied, and they'll make sure Washington feels the consequences. Canada's method is far from haphazard. By targeting components essential to American car production, they're putting an entire supply network in jeopardy. It's a stark warning that if the US doesn't change course, the pain will only grow. And if you think things are messy now, wait until you see how these tariffs are already reshaping the future of electric vehicles. But gasoline-powered cars are just the tip of the iceberg. There's a more electrifying crisis unfolding behind the scenes. That future just got a lot murkier. At the center of this storm is Tesla, America's pioneering EV manufacturer. Tesla's rise to dominance depends on critical raw materials like lithium, nickel, and aluminum, resources Canada provides in massive quantities. Now Canada is putting the squeeze on these exports. By imposing new tariffs and selective trade restrictions, they're undermining Tesla's carefully orchestrated supply chain. Already, the cost of raw materials is inching upward, forcing Tesla to consider raising car prices or slowing down production lines. And it's not just Tesla feeling the heat. Ford, GM, and other US automakers also rely on Canadian metals and minerals for their EV ambitions. The irony here is glaring. The Biden administration has been pushing hard for more electric cars on American roads, offering subsidies and climate-driven incentives. But with Canada throttling essential supply lines, those green dreams could get delayed, maybe even derailed. The average consumer won't just see higher sticker prices on EVs, they may also face a limited model selection as companies struggle to keep up. Of course, electric car components are far from the only pieces caught in this cross-border tug-of-war. The entire auto supply chain is starting to unravel. Have you ever wondered how a single car can rack up thousands of miles before it even lands in your driveway? Parts often zigzag across the US-Canada border several times during assembly. Engines from one plant in Ontario pair with transmissions from Michigan, only to be shipped back to Canada for final fitting, then back again to the States. It's a high-speed dance that's worked seamlessly until now. New Canadian tariffs and export limits on everything from steel to specialized electronic components are putting the brakes on this flow. Suddenly, parts that once moved friction-free across borders are getting slapped with extra fees and customs delays. Automakers are left with a nasty choice: pay up and pass costs to consumers, or scale back production to save cash. Ford, for example, has already hinted at temporary halts in certain factories, while General Motors is bracing for potential supply chain bottlenecks that could force them to cut back on shifts. These disruptions ripple outward in unexpected ways. Smaller suppliers lose contracts, truckers see reduced shipping demands, and local communities reliant on plant jobs feel the pinch. It's a stark demonstration of how incredibly interconnected the North American auto market is. What started as a tariff on a single product can balloon into a crisis affecting thousands of businesses. And it's not just about economics. Politicians from both countries are suddenly under immense pressure to protect jobs, and that's where things get really explosive. As factory workers face uncertain paychecks and voters express their outrage, the trade war starts to look like a political time bomb. Right now, politicians are taking sides, and the stakes couldn't be higher. Former President Trump has long championed tariffs as a way to protect American industries, promising that they would bring manufacturing jobs roaring back. But the reality on the ground is different. Auto plants in swing states like Michigan, Ohio, and Wisconsin are laying off workers instead of hiring them, raising doubts about whether tariffs are delivering on their promises or hurting the very people they were meant to help. Meanwhile, in Canada, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau is leveraging the situation to rally national pride. He's depicted Canada's moves as a necessary stand against unjust American policies. Many Canadians, outraged by what they view as economic intimidation, have rallied behind him, taking this moment to show that Canada can punch back just as hard as its larger neighbor. With 2024 elections on the horizon in the US, the political ramifications are enormous. Public opinion is shifting, especially among communities that rely heavily on auto manufacturing. Will political leaders find a way to calm these tensions before factories start closing for good? Or are we looking at a prolonged battle that might tip the balance in the next presidential race? While politicians spar, other global players are eyeing opportunities, and they might just reshape the global auto market forever. Trade wars rarely happen in a vacuum. Other nations watch from the sidelines, ready to snatch up lucrative deals if the US stumbles. China, for one, has been increasingly interested in Canadian minerals and energy, precisely the kinds of resources that America's EV manufacturers depend on. If China cements exclusive contracts for lithium, nickel, or aluminum from Canada, the US could find itself shut out. At the same time, European automakers and governments sense an opening. With the North American trade relationship looking shaky, they're searching for ways to strengthen ties with Canada, potentially diverting critical resources away from the US. This strategy also extends to emerging markets in Asia, Africa, and South America, each with its own stake in the global auto supply chain. If the US and Canada remain locked in a standoff, other countries can capitalize on the gap. Such a scenario would have lasting consequences. Once supply routes and trade partnerships move elsewhere, they're notoriously difficult to bring back. American automakers could find themselves with fewer and more expensive options for sourcing key materials. Over time, that can diminish the US's competitive edge and hand valuable market share to foreign car makers. But beyond multinational deals and resource grabs, there's a more immediate concern hitting closer to home. Ordinary Americans feeling the economic squeeze. While news headlines talk about tariffs and billions of dollars, it's everyday people who face the real brunt. Car prices are already climbing due to inflation and production slowdowns, making it tougher for families to afford a new vehicle. In some cities, used car prices have soared too, as fewer new cars hit the market. That means older models suddenly come at a premium, leaving some consumers priced out altogether. Workers on the assembly line are caught in the crossfire. When plants receive fewer parts, they slow production and cut shifts. Overtime pay disappears, and in worst-case scenarios, factories close entirely. These job losses reverberate through local economies. Restaurants see fewer diners, small businesses lose customers, and towns built around auto manufacturing inch closer to economic decay. Meanwhile, inflation is compounding the pain. The cost of basic necessities like groceries and gas continues to rise, leaving many households struggling to pay for both daily essentials and their car payments. For those who lose their jobs in the fallout, the situation can feel bleak. This is where political leaders on both sides of the border are under immense scrutiny. Can they protect their constituents from the very policies they enacted? And as frightening as the situation already is, Canada might still have a far more powerful card up its sleeve, one that goes beyond automobiles. Canada's energy exports to the United States are massive. Oil, natural gas, and even hydroelectric power cross the border daily. If the trade war escalates further, there's speculation Canada could restrict these energy flows as a last resort, a move that would drive up US energy costs overnight and ignite an entirely new level of economic chaos. It's a nuclear option, and Canadian officials have been careful not to tip their hand too soon. But the underlying message remains. If the US keeps piling on tariffs, Canada has plenty of ways to push back that go beyond the auto sector. And that's just one dimension of this crisis. Labor shortages in manufacturing and construction were already an issue, partly due to stricter immigration rules. Factories needing skilled workers can't find enough people to keep production lines running at full capacity. Combine that with trade disputes that make raw materials more expensive or harder to get, and you have a recipe for a long-term industrial decline. So what happens if the US doesn't back down? More auto plants might shift operations overseas to countries with cheaper parts and friendlier trade agreements. Prices for cars, trucks, and SUVs could surge even higher, potentially dampening sales enough to trigger yet more layoffs. Meanwhile, Canada may deepen alliances with nations ready to pay a premium for its resources, sidelining the US from deals it once took for granted. It's a complex puzzle, and as all these forces collide, one thing is clear. The high-stakes drama unfolding at the border could transform North America's economic landscape for years to come. We've seen how a single trade dispute spiraled into a critical standoff, threatening to dismantle the very supply chains that built modern North America. Canada's targeted move against the US auto industry is more than a mere retaliation. It's a strategic shift that exposes vulnerabilities in America's manufacturing heartland. From Tesla's EV ambitions to the factories in Michigan and Ohio, the consequences are rippling far and wide. At the same time, the US is wrestling with labor shortages, soaring inflation, and a complex political landscape leading up to a pivotal election year. Global competitors are watching closely, ready to step in if American companies stumble. So, can America adapt to these new realities? Negotiating a truce that ensures stable supply chains and protects vital industries? Or are we witnessing the early stages of a deeper decline? No one can say for sure, but one thing's certain. The decisions made in the coming months will shape not just the car you drive, but the jobs people hold, the price of everyday goods, and the power dynamics across the globe. How do you see this playing out? Is it time for a compromise, or will both nations dig in their heels? Share your thoughts below. We want to hear your take on where this high-stakes showdown is headed.